as in the both at Sheffield. Amy, you're a master's student, and Alison's doing her PhD. So we're doing a paper now a panel about marginal spaces, and Amy is going to go first. And she is doing the death of women in modern tragedies. So we're going to have 15 minutes for each paper and then questions at the end.
So first, Othello does not share this quintessential Englishness that many consider to be a key aspect of domestic tragedies. But as Marginal stated, the play Othello is a Venetian subject set within Venice despite a change in location during the play. And this localises the play in a similar way to as if it were actually set in England. Although there are allusions to war in the play, it is very much about personal relationships, perceived adultery and the breakdown of the marriage. Sean Benson also writes about Othello being an example of domestic tragedy, albeit a non-conventional example, in his book Shakespeare, Othello and Domestic Tragedy, and therefore Othello can be classified as a domestic tragedy, and it's suitable for this paper. Death in domestic tragedies are often less theatrical than those in early modern tragedies, but this is mainly because they play out in private spaces, and we are witnessing what happens behind closed doors. But these deaths are a great deal more intimate because they are confined within these private domestic spaces. The private nature of these spaces causes the audience to become voyeurs to domestic violence, an aspect of domestic tragedies that feminist critics often focus on. And these audiences are forced to watch private but extremely violent scenes play out in public venues. Voyeurism makes these death scenes incredibly difficult to watch as they are not meant to be viewed by public audiences. As deaths in early modern tragedies are when they are performed in public spaces, but instead they are secret spectacles. However, some deaths in private spaces are very public as they are witnessed by an onstage audience. And this calls into question the indicators of a private space. Is it enough for the private space in question to be a domestic space? Or must we consider other criteria when deciding what a private space is? But for the purpose of this paper, I considered a private space to be a domestic space, away from the court but inhabited by many people, including servants, who may witness the deaths in question. There is much criticism surrounding the ideas of gendered and feminised death in early modern tragedies, but critics usually focus on the hows and the whys of female death, rather than concerning themselves with the places in which women die. It is true that men also die within the domestic space of the home, but as women are often the victims of domestic tragedies, it is important to consider the differences between the representation of male and female deaths that occur in private spaces. I want to focus on women that die in the marital bed in domestic tragedies, because this is perhaps the most private space within the home, as according to Catherine Richardson, the bed itself produces an intimate space by focusing the audience's attention. The representation of domestic interiors explores the idea that there are rites of passage which focus around the bed, including both death and birth, and that the action of domestic plays are often centred on one crucial prop, and in this case, the bed. The two examples that I will look at are of women dying in their marital beds are Anne Frankfurt from Thomas Heywood's 1603 play, A Woman Killed with Kindness, a play which concerns itself with adultery where the main character dies due to her husband's kindness, hence the title, and Desdemona in Shakespeare's Othello. These women die in very different ways, but the deaths are considered to be suitable for the crime of adultery, as Anne Frankfurt dies of self-starvation, a sign of female obedience during the medieval and early modern eras, and Desdemona is killed by her betrayed husband. Although Anne Frankfurt dies within the marital bed, a fundamentally private space, her death is a public spectacle witnessed by an on-stage audience as well as the off-stage audience. Anne enters scene 17 of A Woman Killed with Kindness mid-scene, already in her bed. And it can be argued that this entrance draws Anne to the centre of both the on- and off-stage audience's attention. Anne makes her death a public scene to display her atonement, that she is confined to the bed due to self-starvation, and she uses her physical appearance as a way to exhibit her moral transformation as a sign of her repentance. Anne even asks, "Can you not read my fault writ in my cheek? Is not my crime there?" And thus she is drawing attention to her appearance. However, the space of the bed is a highly private, intimate space, which creates this sense of voyeurism. The bedchamber was originally the site of a secret spectacle, as it is initially representing the space where Anne is able to fulfill her sexual desires, but she and other women pay for their sexuality with their deaths, and Lisa Hopkins argues that they leave behind them a cultural legacy of the practice of defining and describing women's nature as physiologically conditioned. However, Anne's death is a public spectacle, and thus the bedchamber becomes a moral space, a space where women learn the consequences of their actions. And the marital bed in this case represents both sin of adultery and repentance. Ultimately, the intention of using the bed to display Anne's death is to ensure that Anne's moralised body becomes the focus of the scene, and it also represents Anne's resumption of her domestic roles, rather than creating the scene of intimacy. Anne knows that this is the bed in which she will die, as in an earlier scene she plans her death in great detail. So to my deathbed, for from this hour I will nor eat nor drink nor taste of any cakes that may preserve my life. In a later scene she asks of her husband John Frankfurt, will he not deign to see me here before I die, here being the marital bed, which once again highlights that this is the bed in which Anne will die. It's often referred to as her nuptial bed, but it also is referred to her deathbed and even a cold grave for Anne. When John Frankfurt evokes the image of the nuptial bed becoming this cold grave, he is prescribing to the tradition of associating marriage with death, which even includes a linguistic nexus which dates back to ancient times. There are several images throughout early modern plays of the personified figure of death, ravishing young women, and in the domestic tragedy The Witch of Edmonton, Susan even calls the figure of death her husband, bringing death into the domestic space of marriage and thus the marital bed. Both John Frankfurt and Anne continuously refer to Anne's bed in scenes 16 and 17 of A Woman Killed with Kindness, and the space of the marital bed is even reinforced through a second wedding before it is transformed into the deathbed. Frankfurt draws attention to the fact that Anne will die in the bed, but it is also the bed where she became his wife and the mother to his pretty babes, and he underlines the associations between marriage and death. This emphasis, Frankfurt also emphasises this image by exclaiming that he is new married and new widowed after Anne's death, therefore linking marriage and death together in the same line. Okay. In Shakespeare's Othello, several characters die within the space of the home, as much of the play is set within this domestic space. The quote used as the title of this paper refers to Act 5, Scene 2 of Othello, where Othello says to Desdemona, "Thou art on my deathbed," and Desdemona replies, "Aye, but not yet to die." These lines indicate that the marital bed was also often the deathbed, as Desdemona expects to die within her bed at some point in the future. This could suggest that women were expected to die in childbirth or even naturally in the bed, rather than the unnatural deaths of murder or execution as women are often subjected to in tragedies. Desdemona's reply also highlights the domestic nature of the play, and she imagines a somewhat normal life with Othello, where she will one day die of natural causes. Desdemona's death is not a public spectacle in the way that Anne Frankfurt's is, but it is perhaps the only truly private death scene in Othello, as the only people on stage during this scene are Desdemona, Othello, and Amelia. It could be argued that the presence of Amelia can make Desdemona's death a public spectacle, but Amelia does not actually witness the event take place, even though she's present when Desdemona finally dies. In an earlier scene, Desdemona requests for Amelia to lay on her bed her wedding sheets, and this is significant because her wedding sheets become her shroud in death. Her bed becomes her grave as her wedding sheets prepare her for burial. Desdemona is said to be as still as the grave, although she is not yet dead, and this once again draws attention to the similarities between the bed and the grave, as Desdemona lies like a corpse upon her marital bed as she would in the grave. Amelia's role in the play is parallel to Desdemona's, as she is also betrayed and killed by her husband Iago. Therefore, Amelia's death also mirrors Desdemona's death, as she dies within the private space of Desdemona's bedroom, although her death is a much more public spectacle. She requests to be placed by her mistress's side on the bed, and thus Amelia also dies upon a marital bed, although it is not her own, and she is shrouded by wedding sheets, prepared for burial. Amelia's death reflects Desdemona's in almost every way, as it is an act of domestic violence which occurs within the domestic space, but it is also a representation of her loyalty to Desdemona, as she dies within Desdemona's bed rather than the bed that she shares with Iago. Sharing a bed with Desdemona also illustrates Amelia's love for her mistress. And Amelia's loyalty indicates that Desdemona's death in the bed that she shares with Othello is also about loyalty and love, as Desdemona protests Othello's innocence to Amelia before she dies. "Oh, who hath done this deed? Nobody, I, myself." The deaths of Anne, Amelia and Desdemona are all acts of domestic violence carried out by men, even though Anne has only been killed through her husband's kindness. And therefore female death within domestic spaces is a result of male jealousy and brutishness, which can easily be hidden by the private space of the home. Once again, we are seeing this behind closed doors effect. However, it is not just women that die in the marital bed. As Othello commits suicide while kissing Desdemona's corpse in their bedroom, "I kiss thee ere I kill thee, no way but this, killing myself to die upon a kiss." Similar to the death of Amelia, Othello's death is a public death within a private domestic space, but it does not evoke the same emotion that Desdemona's death does, even though it occurs within the intimate space of the bedroom. This is due to the manner of Othello's death, as it is presented as heroic rather than tragic. Othello kills the villain when he kills himself, which makes his death an act of heroism. But ultimately, Othello's death on the marital bed once again underscores the domesticity of the play, as husband and wife lay together, surrounded by their wedding sheets. Just to conclude, the domestic tragedies in domestic tragedies, death often occurs within the domestic space of the home, but the most poignant deaths are obviously those of women who die far too early in their marital beds. The nuptial bed, once a place of happiness, becomes the site of tragedy as it is transformed into a place of repentance and moral resolutions. This is a very small sample of the deaths that occur within private spaces. And both the death of Anne and Desdemona occur in the marital bed after an accusation of adultery. In fact, all of the deaths mentioned that occur in domestic spaces are a result of betrayal, and this is a private motive rather than a public one. This could suggest that death has some relation to the crime committed in domestic tragedies, but this subject requires much further research into how both men and women die in domestic spaces before any conclusions can be drawn. However, it is interesting to examine how space affects the representation of death, and how the bedroom signifies both life and death in these plays.
Okay, next is Alison, and she is going to give a paper about footnotes and margins and how they affected finances of a particular editor or culture. So over to us.
You'll be delighted to know that I've interpreted the theme of margins really literally. I'm talking about margins in texts. So I'm a first year PhD researcher, and I'm working on a collection of poems that was published in 1765 and edited by someone called Thomas Percy. Here we go. So there's a very neat story behind the manuscript, which eventually became in 1765 the Relics of Ancient English Poetry, edited by Thomas Percy. The story is recounted by Percy, and it's scribbled on the inside of the manuscript itself and dated the 7th of November 1769. It says, "This is a very curious old manuscript in its present mutilated state, but unbound and sadly torn, etc. I rescued it from destruction and begged it at the hands of my worthy friend Humphrey Pitt. I saw it lying dirty on the floor under a bureau in the parlour, being used by the maids to light the fire. It was afterwards sent, most unfortunately, to an ignorant bookbinder who pared the margin when I put it into boards in order to lend it to Dr. Johnson." So, quite apart from the double defacement of being demargined by an ignorant bookbinder and scrawled on by Percy himself, who was meant to be editing it, the manuscript appears as a rather enticing, almost talismanic remnant from another realm, displaced and deprived of its original status and meaning. Its final function has become to get the fire going in the parlour. The manuscript became just one of several sources used by Percy in his Relics, which was a 3-volume collection of ballads and medieval romances published by James Dodsley, and which was received with widespread praise. The first print run in 1765, in February of 1765, was 1,500 copies, and in 5 weeks, 600 of these had been sold, and the price was half a guinea each, per 3 volumes, which is about £60 in today's money, so that gives you a sense of the part of the market that he was aiming for. In the next 30 years, 3 further editions of the relics were published, so again that gives you a sense of how popular it was. From this starting point, it's clear that for Percy, his task in his task of renovating and beautifying his ancient manuscripts, there were 2 distinct but not necessarily competing considerations. Firstly, the poetry, and secondly, the materiality of the text. I want to argue that the marginal notes, and indeed the overall aesthetic appearance of the pages, are as important as the poetry itself. The same fascination which drew Percy to the manuscript, stuffed under the bureau, also drew him into a long and complicated discussion in his correspondence about the best way to finally present the volumes. One of Percy's closest friends was a writer and garden designer called William Shenstone. Their letters map out their strong and contrasting opinions on the form that the relics should take. Percy was adamant that the ballads and romances, which were unfamiliar as high literature and considered instead by most people to be just street poetry, sold at fairs or on street corners and markets and so on, he was convinced that they needed a cloak of footnotes, prefaces and essays to legitimise them and to explain their provenance. In contrast, Shenstone felt that, and this is his words, an elegant, portable volume was not the place for cumbersome and distracting notes which detracted from the purity of the poetry and interrupted the reader's experience of the text. The French structuralist critic Gérard Genette has described the footnote as a disorder of the text, and whilst he concedes that it is a disorder that may have its proper use, he maintains that footnotes are always secondary to the main body text. In the 1760s, Shenstone's warnings to Percy seem almost to anticipate Genette. He repeatedly advises Percy to limit or eliminate altogether the notes from his poetic collection. And here he goes, in October 1760, he writes to him. And he says, "The absolute necessity of notes will be the rock that you may chance to split on. I hope they'll be as short as possible, either at the end of every piece or thrown into the form of a glossary at the end of the collection. Perhaps some small preface at the beginning also may supersede the use of many." Here, for Shenstone, notes have the capacity to destroy or sabotage the whole publication, and their potency needs to be corralled and contained in specific places on the page, preferably for him at the end of the whole volume or possibly at the beginnings and ends of individual poems. They shouldn't occupy too much space on the page, and nor should they encroach on the poetry itself. The next month, Shenstone warns, obviously didn't feel like he'd taken any notice of him, Shenstone warns that if Percy doesn't follow his guidance, and here's a quotation, "the text will be almost smothered by these encumbrances in every part." And finally, 2 years later, in 1762, he kind of puts the polite to one side and he says, and you can kind of almost hear him, scraping his pen against the letter paper that he's writing on, "Once and for all, it is extremely certain that the overproportion of this kind of ballast will sink your vessel to the bottom of the sea. Therefore, be upon your guard. Be upon your guard in time. Neither have you any reason to be apprehensive that your volume should be deficient in point of bulk, i.e. there is enough, do not put more footnotes in, stop. You are not to accost the public." His frustration is palpable, and his melodramatic and hyperbolic language conveys a really clear message that in his view, the stylish and polite reader, and more importantly perhaps purchaser of poetry in the 1760s, doesn't want to be bombarded with an antiquarian style jumble of dates, cross-references, tunes, micro-histories and justification. Precious space in the collection should be used for poetry and poetry alone. Anything else would be an affront to the reader. Shenstone was certainly more business-minded than Percy, and his harshness could perhaps be read as an attempt to ensure that Percy's publication was as commercially successful as it could be. Unfortunately, very few of Percy's replies to Shenstone's letters survive, so we can't know how he reacted to Shenstone's repeated and increasingly fervent warnings. However, in a letter from about the same time discussing another text Percy was also working on called 5 Runic Pieces, which was translations from the Icelandic, of course, Percy seems to acknowledge Shenstone up to a point, but is ultimately governed by his convictions that the notes are not simply desirable but necessary. He says, "You'll probably be disgusted to see this so encumbered with notes, yet some are unavoidable as the piece would be unintelligible without them." In this case, the notes provide an explanation and a translation of a foreign poem, bringing it into the field of understanding for a modern reader. Whilst the Relics was not dealing with actual translations, although there are French and Spanish poems included in the collection, the notes function in the same way. They usher an unfamiliar and previously overlooked body of poetry into the drawing rooms and salons of polite 18th century readers. The humble ballad was in many ways as alien to readers of polite literature as poetry written in a different language. So let's look at some images of what the Relics actually finally looked like. And think about what role the footnotes, headnotes, prefaces and glossaries played. The complete work is 3 volumes long, and it's unsurprising that the first volume has a disproportionate paratextual content. By paratextual, I mean things like footnotes, prefaces, explanatory essays, glossaries, so all the stuff which is not the actual poetry. These images are in this selection are ones that I took a couple of weeks ago from a second edition copy of 1767, which is held in the British Library. The most dominant form of note is the head note, so at the beginning of a poem, serving as a mini introduction to each poem. They vary in length from a couple of lines to several pages, and in style from the purely informative to the speculative and discursive. In fact, Percy has actually tidied up his pages considerably. There aren't masses of footnotes throughout the volumes, and they don't smother the poetry as Shenstone had feared. The impression is rather one of layering and tissuing. The poetic texts exist as one discursive strand, but alongside them are notes, essays, and glossaries that Percy refused to relinquish. Looking at a fairly representative page, the footnotes take up between about a quarter and a third of the page. In terms of layout, there's a visual contrast between the justified, it's a little bit blurry, but you get the impression. Between the justified left and the right margins of the footnotes and the conventional indented layout of the poem. The spacing of the poem is more aerated and elongated than the dense italicized notes, and in some ways more appealing to the reader's eye. Here, format echoes or reinforces ideas about types of knowledge and the way we approach them as readers. More interestingly, the footnotes in this example illustrate the polyvalent nature of Percy's notes. So the first note, and I'm sorry you can't actually read the words on the page, but you have to believe me. The first note makes a subjective judgment about the style of the poem. So Percy says it's uncommonly rugged and uncouth. Whereas the second note gives us some historical and geographical context. He says the Battle of Hombley Down or Humbleton was fought on September the 14th, 1402. Even within the notes, there's a variety of function and tone which adds to the sense that they present not a unified factual backstory, but a various and plural counter-narrative to the poetic text. Another feature of the notes is the inconstant use of numbering and lettering systems, different fonts, often for notes within notes, and a panoply of printer's marks to signify a note. So here's a nice page, which is a little bit of a better picture. So this is the head note from a poem called As He Came from the Holy Land. So this is not the poem, this is the introduction to the poem. There's a footnote to the head note, which is signalled by an asterisk, which is down here. And within that, there's a quotation from Langland's Piers Plowman, which is printed in the black letter font. So these 2 little lines down at the bottom there are the quotation from Piers Plowman. And that's in contrast to the Roman font, which is used everywhere else on the page. Thus, the poems chosen for inclusion in the collection are connected to other literary texts, perhaps more well established or accepted as part of an English literary heritage, and fonts are used to demarcate difference in literary distance. As an aside, by the way, it's ironic that Percy uses the black letter font to represent those established texts like Piers Plowman, which he cites because the black letter was, certainly in the mid-18th century, very closely associated with printed broadside ballads, and therefore they're the very poems which Percy is trying to elevate and recalibrate in the Relics, and yet he's using a font which is associated with them for a kind of more established canonical text. Anyway, creating yet another layer of the text, within this quotation, so within Piers Plowman here at the bottom, sorry, you can't show you, there you go. Percy uses double dagger or diesis to alert the reader to a note to the language used by Langland. He footnotes the word her as i.e. there. My point is that none of these points are seen by Percy as lesser or insignificant. They all have a direct bearing on the reader's understanding and acceptance of the poem. Both visually and textually, Percy creates a rather dizzying web of information, opinion, example and explanation. Perhaps this is why Shenstone not unreasonably, urged him to contain all his notes in one place. Looking at the 1767 edition, there's an interesting development from the original 1765 edition. By 1767, Percy had rewritten the bulk of his essay on the ancient English minstrels and seems to have heeded, a little late, one might say, Shenstone's advice. So on the page facing the essay, so this is the essay on the right-hand side, obviously, and this little section here, he uses a manacle, which is a very exciting word, which is that little pointy finger there, and it's the only time it's used in the whole text, to draw a formal decision to the reader's attention. And this little note says, the larger notes and illustrations belonging to the following essay, not to encumber the pages, are thrown together to the end and are referred to by capital letters A, B, etc. So it seems like the language that he's using here in his note to explain how notes are used almost echoes exactly the language used by Shenstone in a letter 5 years before the first edition. And Shenstone had said, I would throw both the general argument and particular notes together at the close, for otherwise your text will be almost smothered by the encumbrances in every part. Notes smother and encumber and should be thrown to the end of the text, manhandled into their proper place. Here again we see a layering of possible ways of reading, and Percy building into the text a constant deferral, like Borges's Garden of Forking Paths. The reader is directed onwards and ever onwards by hands, by stars, by daggers, and it's often hard to know which of the fragments we read is the most important. To return to Gerard Genette, he states that the main text is always the dominant one and the footnote is always secondary. What he says, whatever aesthetic or ideological investment the author makes in a paratextual element, whatever coquettishness or paradoxical reversal he puts into it, the paratextual element is always subordinate to its text. In contrast to this view, in the Relics, Percy refuses to privilege one discourse over another and makes a hierarchised reading of the whole text not only impossible, but also barren. Shenstone's motivations were in fact fair enough, if extremely expressed. Texts encumbered with notes were familiar to 18th century readers from the huge number of antiquarian books being published in the period. Antiquarian texts had a reputation for being tedious, rambling and prolix, written by men who, as Rosemary Sweet suggests, whose pedantry submerged the lessons of the past in a morass of detail. Shenstone didn't want this to be the fate of the Relics. In his preface to the first edition, Percy explained, in a polished age like the present, I'm sensible that many of the relics of antiquity will require great allowances to be made for them. He was desperately keen to reinvigorate the reading public's understanding of English poetry and was doing something quite radical by suggesting that ballads and medieval romances, songs and stories from the streets and fields should be re-evaluated and considered as the true ancestors of much great English literature. So he makes very clear connections with Chaucer, with Spenser, Shakespeare and Milton. Nearly done. The paratexts constituted the allowances that should be made and were a way of connecting the modern 18th century reader with his or her literary past. The phenomenal popularity of the Relics stands as a vindication of Percy's editing and structural choices. The reading public enthusiastically consumed his new poetic dish, and Percy's dedication and sense of duty was praised by both scholars and men of taste. Thomas Warton, chair of poetry at Oxford, wrote to Percy in April 1765 that the Relics had opened a new field of poetry and supplied many new and curious materials for the history and illustration of ancient English literature. So the good ship Relics had not split upon any rocks and was safely launched on a journey that in many ways changed the course of English poetry. That's just a nice page.
Okay, we're going to open the floor to questions now. Anybody have something?
I have a question for Amy. You talked mainly about sort of married couples in kind of sort of buying debts in the domestic sphere in relation to that. Do you know much about sort of sibling relationships in the domestic sphere? Because I mean, I talked about a brother killing his sister in a very private setting.
I think the only example that I can think of, and it's a really odd one, is Tis for Teachers All by John Ford, and that will have it, but that is an odd relationship between a brother and sister, where the death does happen inside the bed. He stabs her and pulls her heart out. So it's very graphically violent, and it is this very different relationship. So that's the only one that I can think of on the top, off the top of my head.
That's interesting, thank you.
question for Alison, if that's all right. Do the footnotes in any way try and reintroduce an oral element to it?
No. Yes, the footnotes do. And I think it's very strange that Percy is not interested at all in the poems as ballads, and he's not interested that they're oral literature, he's not interested that they're transcribed from old grannies in Aberdeen and whatever. He's interested in them as text per text. And actually in the footnotes, he sometimes allows himself to kind of ramble off into mythology and kind of fantasy. So there's another example where the poem is really quite dull and boring, but the footnote starts talking about different ways to summon fairies that magicians have used, and it goes off on a kind of 3/4 of a page ramble about that. So he's, in a way, I think that there's more of a kind of oral sense in some of the histories that are told in the notes than there are in the poems, which is a kind of reversal of what you might expect. But that's something that I'm kind of working on at the moment as well, to think about the different voices that are in the text.
Yeah, I've got two questions, if that's okay. One for Amy and one for Alison. So first and foremost, regarding Shakespeare, Macbeth really comes to mind, and how Lady Macbeth dies off stage in a very private domestic setting, and it's just reported. And a broken Macbeth defiantly shouts, "I'll fight for my body, my flesh be hacked." So in terms of staging Shakespeare and presenting the death of a heroine, which might not be in the footnotes, and presenting the death of a villain or a hero, what sort of bias is there between genders there?
A lot of graphic, from what I've read, a lot of graphic offstage, a lot of graphic female deaths happen off stage. So you get public, but the same is true of, say, Iago. His death happens off stage. We know that he's going to be tortured, but we don't actually see it happen. I don't think there's generally a bias between gender. I think it was treated equally. You get a lot of graphic female death that everyone witnesses, not just the offstage audience. They're witnessed by onstage audiences too. But they're generally treated by the onstage audience very differently than, say, the deaths of heroes or villains are. They're often treated with a lot more sympathy, so that you get that from both the on and off stage audience. So there is a gender bias, but it's not necessarily the staging, it's more in the reaction to the staging, if that helps.
Thanks. And Alison, so remind me of the debate at the Hampton Court Conference where James I condemned the marginalia in the Geneva Bible and how it could be misleading and subversive. And I know the Bible is sort of the instructor for revolution, rebellion. So, but moving on to the wider corpus of literature per se, moving into the 18th century, is there still a sort of anxiety about marginalia, about which is paratextual, being able to mislead an audience or reader?
I don't know whether I don't think it's so much about misleading an audience, or a reader. I think it's quite often looked upon, or I think one of the reasons that Shenstone wanted to have Percy avoid having too much paratextual presence is because it's really closely associated with antiquarian practice, which was really, enjoyed quite a rich period in the early 18th century and actually on in the 18th century. But the kind of antiquarians were looked upon as rather fusty, introspective, and old-fashioned fuddy-duddies, and not really as serious scholars. And the antiquarian style was, you would have 2 words of text on a page and 98 lines of footnotes about where this was and what the soil content of this thing was, and all sorts of things, and about where this coin was found and how this coin actually shows that Ethelred was related to and so all of this stuff, which is seen as just being dry basically. And I don't know, in Walter Scott's The Antiquary, the Antiquary is called Jonathan Olcott, but he's described as being kind of in this myopic man who's in his dark cave and doesn't have any awareness of the outside world. So I don't know if they're not seen as being misleading, but they're seen as kind of detracting from the main text. And I think Shenstone was really concerned that Percy made a success of this project, and I think that's why he tried to steer him away. But Percy was not for being persuaded, because he basically said, I hear what you're saying, I'm putting them in anyway. So.
Go you then, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you. I was just picking up for you, Alison, when you mentioned the black letter font, which is sort of a footnote to your paper. I was just asking them why that was the case. My understanding is that black letter was a sort of, in the hierarchies of literacies, it was sort of lower down, it was more popular forms.
Yeah, and that's what I was kind of puzzling over, because broadside ballads, which were published, in a kind of in like leaflets to be handed out and read at fairs or posted up on walls, and or in a Shakespeare play which has got Autolycus in it, can't remember. Thank you. Autolycus goes in his job is to sell parcels of ballads at the fair, and so. If I understand your question correctly, yes, that's exactly the point, that black letter is way down at the bottom of the hierarchy, but in that footnote where it was used, he was using it as a different font, to quote Piers Plowman, which seemed to me a bit of an inversion of what
broadsheets that weren't restricted to black letter font.
I don't know.
With the different types, at least in 17th century.
Okay, I'm not sure, I don't know, but I know that it is something at the font which is associated with broadsides.
Okay.
But maybe I need to
Yeah.
have a look.
Rachel?
Sort of following on from what was just said, black letter, at least until the end of the 16th century, is very often used to deliberately evoke a medieval literary tradition, a medieval, very English past. So that's it, maybe John Piers Plowman might be doing that. And also, it reminded me of Spencer's Shepherd's Calendar, which is another text which has a very deliberate gloss, which is very artfully used, which uses black letter in the same way to evoke medieval past. And of course, Edward Spencer was somebody who had a large interest in archaism, so it might be something to follow up on.
I don't know how, from a practical point of view, in the mid-18th century, I don't know what range of fonts were available to the printer. Was it just there was Roman and there was black letter, or were there other things? Now we're kind of used to having a massive range. I don't know. So.
That wasn't actually my question, though. May I?
Go ahead.
You just made me want to read text even more than I wanted to read it already. It's something I've been meaning to get around to for years. And I just wondered what its relation is to the Dunciad, because that, of course, was in its fourth edition in 1742, and it's a text which has got loads and loads of notes in all sorts of different fonts, operative in different spaces in the page, doing very different things.
I don't know. I need to go back and read it.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you. I will pursue that. Sorry.
No,
That's
it's
a question.
Yeah, it's a bit of a, it's a big question. It's a big text on side, so yeah.
Yeah, I think there's probably more question, Tom.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, Amy, how interested are you in the band as a kind of stage property and stage spectacle? I mean, what can we learn about what bands look like? What whether acting companies have property bands? It seems to me that you can manipulate that to look a lot like a tomb or something like that, can't you? And I wonder if that's a visual effect to counterpoint some of the rhetorical effects that you were referring to.
Yeah, I did a bit of research into different types of beds and how beds were used in sort of the medieval period and how they were used as sort of to view the dead. So people would go into the bedroom to view the dead, and that's how they would mourn. But so yeah, I think the physical prop of the bed is incredibly useful when signifying what type of reaction you're meant to have to this scene, I guess. So if it's a lavish bed, you're perhaps meant to understand that it is a marital bed, but if it's like Desdemona's has been stripped bare and she's just got her marital sheets on, she specifically requests for those sheets to be put on, you understand that this is more of a viewing bed where the deceased will be put on display, I guess. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to see if there's any record of props and how they're used, rather than just looking at the text themselves. Maybe look at how these plays were actually performed. So yeah, thank you.
I think we're done. Yeah. Okay, we're going to have a break now.
So let's just give our speakers another round of applause for their brilliant